This is the FM Gold channel of All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, we now bring you a discussion on Air Force, a journey so far. The participants are Air Vice Marshal retired Kapil Kark and Ajay Banerjee, journalist.
India is observing the first anniversary of the airstrikes over Balakot and, of course, air duel over Nowshera, where Wing Commander Abhinandan Vardhaman took on the Pakistan Air Force and he got shot down. Since this morning, the Air Force and senior pilots have been discussing the matters, how the Air Force has been or how it has come about. Kaksab, I will want to take you to the Air Force, what you say when we got independent. 62, we did not use the Air Force, 65 war or 71 war. And 99, could you describe 65 first for our listeners?
Well, 65 was one war, if we say the scales were against us. Pakistan had the best Air Force. It had been trained by the Americans over previous 11 years. We had lower order of magnitude type of weapons, and yet we pinched the victory in our favor. It was the man in the cockpit and the support infrastructure and the morale and the training levels which actually made us win that war. But I think if we are talking about the journey so far, it's important to go back to 1924, 23 years before independence. The Skene Committee, in which Motilal Nehru was one of the key members, recommended an independent Air Force. That is a landmark. An independent Air Force for India recommended in 1924 and eventually happened in 32. And in 1947, within 9 weeks of independence, the Indian Air Force was in action. 9 weeks.
Yes, Srinagar.
Nobody knew whether one could land there. You got the Indian Army boots on the ground. Pakistani raiders 10 miles or 15 miles away from the airfield. You see how then you use the fighter aircraft for supply dropping in Skardu, transport aircraft for bombing in Punch. Look at the adaptability, flexibility, professionalism of the Air Force, bloodied in a conflict within 9 weeks of independence. So if you look at it in that sense, today we are talking about Air Force being the sword arm, the instrument of national power. That's what we showed in Balakot. It was a standalone operation. No other service was involved. And it was left to the Indian Air Force to now send a signal to the world, to our Western neighbor, paradigmatic shift in the response to terror emanating from Pakistan by saying, here we calibrate the escalation such that the escalation ladder we will decide, you will not decide. And that's what exactly happened.
Kaksar, I will take you back to 1971. Actually, the glory hour of the Indian Armed Forces. The Indian Air Force did a great job, bombed Peshawar, bombed several places in Pakistan, as we know from the history books, and also a virtual takeover of the East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, the helicopters moving troops from across River Meghna. All that is part of history. How important was 1971 war of the Air Force growing or stabilizing itself?
It was in many ways a decisive moment for the Air Force. It was a decisive moment for the Armed Forces of India. It was a moment of celebration world over that an armed forces could create a nation. Synergies of the highest order. You talked about Peshawar things. I did a mission over Mianwali, which is the westernmost Pakistani airfield. And dark night, low levels of 100 feet, 200 feet. 71 was a glorious period. At the same time, it is important for us to know that we will not fight 71 again. That wars are changing. If we see last 30 years, what has been the characteristic of warfare? Changing warfare. But one obstinate part of that warfare is the role of air power. Whether it was a Gulf War, whether it was war in Afghanistan, whether it was the Iraq War, whether it was Kargil, war in Georgia, Syria, all these are purely power-centric, not a soldier moves on the ground. It may not apply entirely in the Indian context, but our decision makers have to keep into the calculus one overriding reality, that our air power must be configured, it must be strong, it must be deterrent if we are to live in peace.
Since you talk about air power, the modernization part, we have in the past 12 years added some very new and modern equipment. The C-130J from the Lockheed Martin, the C-17 from the Boeing. Those two are strategic lift and heavy lift planes for our listeners. And also we have recently in the past 1 year started inducting the Apache 64E helicopter, the attack helicopter, and also the Chinook heavy lift helicopter. Now, can you explain to our listeners how does it change war in the Himalayas? And Apache, how does it change war on the ground?
Firstly, Chinook is a heavy lift helicopter. We had a Russian heavy lift helicopter which has been with us for nearly 30 years and more. And there was just one left. So you can imagine the whole country has one heavy lift helicopter. This is not only used for requirement of the armed forces, but heavy lift requirement for civil services either, whether it's bridge building, whether it's going up in the Himalayas, because very, very large loads are taken up by that. Chinook will meet that requirement. So, in other words, if you define modernization as replacement of one by the other, yes, it is a modernization, but it's also transformational because the capability curve enhancement is so large. Speeds have increased, glass cockpit, ease of flying, ease of maintenance, modular construction. So, you're actually gaining all in what you talked about the Chinook. Apache is again a Mi-25, Mi-35 replacement. But again, very, very large improvements in terms of capabilities and what it can deliver on the ground by way of precision, by way of targeting, by way of effect that you're achieving. Basically an anti-tank platform.
We are adding 36 Rafales. We already have around 250 of the Sukhois, which we are upgrading. And today the Air Chief Marshal R.K.S. Bhadoria Saab at the seminar of the Center for Air Power Studies said that they are also looking to have the Astra missile put on the Sukhoi 30 and the MiG-29. So the numbers you already spoken about, putting the Astra missile on these two platforms, the Sukhoi and the MiG-29. And also please talk about putting the BrahMos on the Sukhoi, please. How does it change? As
far as Astra is concerned, it is a proven indigenous air-to-air missile with a specific range. May not match the range of the AIM-120 which the Pakistani F-16s have, or the Meteor, reportedly a range of about 150 kilometers, which is what equips the Rafale. But Astra is indigenous. And our biggest problem has been, do we have the right missile for our Sukhoi 30s? Because the Russian missile does not meet our requirement, the Pakistani Air Force outguns it. So that's why the Sukhoi 30 in the engagement on 27th of February did a great job. But I think Astra is a very neat way to go. One other factor which needs a little highlighting or underscoring is that of adaptability. Wars are changing. As I mentioned earlier, we are not going to fight the 71 war. We are not going to fight the Kargil war. We may not even do a Balakot again. We may do a different Balakot. Air Force has to get used to fighting air power or Air Force application with cyber force application, both in defense and. So cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, unmanned aerial vehicles, space, and non-state actors all acting together pose a completely new challenge to which the Air Force has to get used.
Sir, as you say, there will be no 71. There possibly will not be another Balakot. But do you think we could move on to armed drones? Because we're already in talks with some countries to build armed drones, one. And two, how important will be space-based assets? One for a defensive role and second for an offensive role.
Both an affirmative yes. I've just gave the examples of how unmanned drones are changing the nature of warfare. And in fact, even air power faces that challenge of those unmanned drones. And in those unmanned drones, I think the critical requirement is for us to do a technological leap of faith in artificial intelligence and in machine learning. Because the counter-drone technology is centered on these two aspects of artificial intelligence and machine. This is where Indian Air Force has to occupy the technological high ground along with space, which you asked me, both in the offensive and the defensive. And lastly, but not least, that of cyber warfare. Because our vulnerability on space-based assets in terms of connectivities, in terms of forward data links, in terms of sensor-to-shooter communication, it's all dependent on space. And if those vulnerabilities are attacked by our adversaries, whether it's Pakistan Air Force or the Chinese Air Force, then we are in a huge crisis. So to overcome the prospect of that crisis ever occurring, we have no choice but to address unmanned drones, to ensure that our space assets are in no way compromised, to ensure that we have both an offensive and defensive cyber capability, and lastly, to ensure there is seamless communication. There is a double bank, there is firewalling, and there is in many ways grid encircling of whatever is our strong potential in the communication.
So when we talk about modernization, I cannot leave out the additions to the air defense part, especially the S-400 missile, which we are getting from the Russians. Defense missile will create a kind of envelope around the country, that's what we are told. How does the S-400 change the paradigm?
It's a game changer. Because if you combine this with the prospect of what's called the NATSAM, which has been discussed with Americans, I think references were made to that during President Donald Trump's visit, it makes certain areas so invulnerable that you can catch a fly. Fly goes through that zone, it will be shot down. That is the kind of capabilities in air defense. But I think we need to address, you talked about the seminar today, but there was also a seminar 2 days ago. And this is where I believe very strongly as a professional who wore an Air Force uniform for 40 years, that we have to look at leadership. It's the person who will lead. It's the person who's in the cockpit. It's the question of women in the Air Force now, not just in non-combat and combat support stream, but also, as you know, in the combat itself. So these changes, how do you train them? How do you train leaders to adjust themselves to a changing nature of war and what I described as so many complexities brought about by that changing nature? So the air power is a dynamic force and it keeps changing by the minute. It's a mind game. So it is the minds which have to be changed. Therefore, it is not just strategization, it's also role of think tanks. On the one hand, we are doing jointmanship. Think tanks of individual services will now have to go, like Center for Air Power, not CAPS, but College of Air Power in Hyderabad. They are all going to be connected together. But where do you get the specialization? For specialization, you have to go to the non-service think tanks like Center for Studies, Land Warfare Studies, or Joint Warfare Studies, or National Maritime Foundation. These think tanks have to flourish all over. And these are all civilian military and not purely confined.
40 years ago, if I understand correctly, the pilot's bravado was the prime importance. Today with technology, does it mean technology takes the lead plus the bravado? Say a guy who is monitoring the armed drone from behind is actually doing no bravado. Is this technology used? How do you see this?
I would stay on the safe course there because it's too early. Technology hasn't yet overtaken. Technology, yes, is crucial, important. But the man, it is the man who has to, and that's why a great emphasis on leadership, because the person has to be firstly technologically savvy. It may not be long before every single pilot in the Air Force is an engineer, and especially a computer engineer, even more importantly. So then you have technology and bravado, as you said, mixing in a very delicate kind of an equation. One part is needed, it's available. If the other part is needed, that's also available. But one last point I think I would like to make this conversation wholesome is that we forget, while we are talking about 65 and Peshawar raid, and we forget the role of transport aircraft and helicopters. Crises take place by the hour. Yesterday, around this time, we had an aircraft C-17 come back from Wuhan. Not just bringing our people, but also bringing foreigners. You have air power. So Air Force has a role in the foreign policy of a nation. It's not just in defense. Likewise, you recall in 1991, we brought out 113,000 of our citizens from Iraq, which was at that time from Kuwait and that area, because Saddam Hussein decided to do what he did. Subsequently, in Lebanon, 2006, again, ships took them to a spot from where Indian Air Force aircraft brought them back. Point I'm trying to make that we have to look at the Air Force in its journey so far holistically and comprehensively, which means examine every component of that power, the sword arm of the country, and see where are the weaknesses which need to be plugged so that it remains as a potent instrument of national power, which it has always been.
Sir very eloquently explained the power of the Air Force, how it is growing and how technology is coming in, and how cyberspace and of course the newer platforms like the unmanned drones, which will soon come into the Air Force. And also, Kak Sahib has spoken about the need to increase the combat power of the fighter jets. Technology is taking us. Thank you, Kak Sahib, for speaking to us.
Thank you very much, Ajay.
You were listening to a discussion on Air Force, a journey so far. The participants were Air Vice Marshal retired Kapil Kark and Ajay Banerjee, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You can also follow us on the News on AIR app for updates. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.